want to do here, okay, and I'll put this up on Sector as a recording, is just go through. Okay, let's go through quickly the task sheet. And I want you to think, we want to go through more than just the task sheet. We want to think about what you need to do to get the marks. Can I just be really clear, right? When you get marked against the criteria sheet. So you always want to read that and see if what you're doing matches up with that. The due date is, I'll get it up, it's on your assessment calendar. So, your context, you've been asked to present at a conference for legal studies teachers. So your challenge is to find the interesting elements around what you're presenting for the legal studies teachers. You don't have to present as though when you go to the case study, that you're on the side of the pet or the side of the children or anything like that. You're presenting for a legal studies teacher. And you're looking at the issues related to wills that comes out of the story. So some of the things you have to do, these are the words from the criteria. You have to describe the law that relates to wills. You've already looked at some of those things, right? Beneficiaries, being of sound mind. Explain the purpose of wills. So when you think about this, think, what is the purpose of wills overall? Is there some legislation that you can use around describing wills, explaining how they work? Maybe there's even some court cases you might want to refer to. Analyse the situation to identify legal issues and stakeholders' perspectives. So you can decide what legal issues you're going to focus on in this story about wills and pets. It could be a whole lot of things. You could go at quite a tangent. You could go to the point of saying, well, should someone even be able to challenge a will? That might be the issue. You've got these children who are unhappy about a pet being left stuff in a will. But I think there are some other legal issues that you then have to consider, because you have to consider, I think a core one is, can you actually leave assets to pets? So you'd have to deal with the little ones, and you go off on a different one, a different legal issue. And you have to just determine the legal outcomes. And probably the easiest way to do that is to look at the case and say, what's going to happen here? Who should get what? What's going to be a fair outcome in this situation? Based on the law, based on precedent cases. Then evaluate the law. Is it just and reasonable? Is it just and reasonable that someone can be able to leave their assets to a pet? You can argue yes, you could argue no, whatever. How would you make recommendations around the interests of families? And what changes would you make to the law? And how do you justify those changes? So that's probably the process you're going to go through here. Let's zip down and look at the story. A terrier cross, a dog named Ferret, has inherited a fortune after being named chief beneficiary in her wealthy owner's will. Assume that this is an Australian story too. We need to assume that this is Australian. On Monday, it was announced that Emily Nancarrow had left $750,000, $750,000 to the dog she and her late husband Don had rescued from the RSPCA over a decade ago. Try to think about the little facts. What in there does it mean that Don is in there? Right? Mrs. Nancarrow has entrusted the continued care of her elderly pet to her neighbours, Leonie and Phil Harris, who reportedly often took Ferret for walks during her owner's final illness. Mrs. Harris, the neighbour, spoke to the Courier Mail reporter yesterday. We told Emily we would be happy to look after Ferret, but had no idea that there would be any money as part of the arrangement. In the event of Ferret's death, the remaining money has been willed to the RSPCA. Mrs. Nancarrow's children, as you can imagine, were unavailable to comment. Not that you would imagine that necessarily, but the bit you would think maybe is that they're a little bit unhappy about their mother's decision. The person who perhaps should love them more than anyone else in the world has decided that Ferret, the dog, is worth $750,000 and they are worth squat. So that's the story. And from that, you've got to come up with some legal issues. You probably have to talk a little bit about the case, but you can do that fairly quickly, like you just say you've got the main things. What are the legal issues you're going to drill down on in this case around wills? Has to be multimodal, right? 3 to 5 for the year 11s, 5 to 7 for the year 12s. You can't just talk to a PowerPoint presentation. More than one thing has to make a significant contribution. So if we go back now to the criteria, right? So you have to show that you're using facts and legal terminology, explain legal concepts and processes. So a lot of those will be around wills this time. Have to communicate in a clear way. Now we get down to, I think, the stuff that becomes more challenging. Have to organise legal information from relevant and valid sources. So that's things like, have you got some other precedent cases that you're referring to? Have you got some legislation? How are you pulling them into your argument? Then you have to analyse the legal situation, so that's Ferret's 750,000 windfall, and think about legal issues and stakeholder perspectives. So remember stakeholders. A stakeholder is not just a pair of tongs at a barbecue. A stakeholder is everyone who is interested in a case. Everyone who's interested in the case. So it might be, in this case, you're thinking about, well, I don't know whether ferret, I don't know if I've heard a dog as referred to as a stakeholder, but some of the stakeholders here are RSPCA because they inherit a lot of money. The children, right, because they haven't got anything. Maybe the husband is a stakeholder in this situation who had already died. Maybe he is too. And then you've also got basically the community idea, right? Because whatever happens here becomes a precedent for people. If I get a little bit old and batty in my old age and I decide to leave my estate to my cat, what happens in this case is probably going to affect the outcome of my case there. So stakeholders, and then to determining logical legal outcomes. So what should happen in this case, do you think? Then we come to this criteria that people, I think, often are a little bit brief, right? Evaluating the law, is it fair and just? Is it fair and just? And stakeholder responses. So coming back to stakeholders, how are the people impacted? Decisions and recommendations about the suitability of legal outcomes and their implications. So that's saying is, how well is the legal framework working in this situation, right? Is it good, or do things have to change? And justifying your decisions and recommendations that you might make to the law. Okay. And we did that the other day when we did that class activity and said, how would we make wills so that they would be challenged a whole lot less? We had to justify why those things. Why does it make a difference if people had to sign off on their wills every year, for example? Or if they had to make an electronic copy of their will, why does that make a difference? Stuff like that. Or I think one of the other suggestions was that they, in a will, not only do you talk about who you want the assets to get to, you explain why you don't want assets to go to other people. So those recommendations that you made explanations for why they work. That's the same